I've inadvertently done something a bit different with this intro, so there's every chance that it's going to be even more nonsensical and tenuous than usual. But I effectively mean by that I'm going to read a review for a film released 26 years prior to Casino. It's for The Wild Bunch, though, a film that was a big influence on Scorsese when he was making this. And watching this film, I think The Wild Bunch is all over it. I don't think it's a coincidence that L.Q. Jones, one of the stars of that film, crops up in quite a key role here, constantly labelled by De Niro as one of the cowboys of the old world. I think it's just as much an intentional placement as Don Rickles here, Mr. Warmth himself, with the difficult role of having to stay largely quiet. He would have been performing in Vegas at the time the film is set. He knew Frank Rosenthal, who De Niro's character was based on. When Nicholas Pileggi was approaching Rosenthal about writing a book about his time in Vegas, Pileggi had co-wrote the screenplay for Goodfellas, written the book it was based on. He went to him, and Rosenthal was uncertain, he was hesitant, until he was told Robert De Niro would play him in the film adaptation, and almost immediately he said yes. Anyway, I think this is very much Scorsese's Western, but instead of banks and saloons, the action's taking place in these flashy casinos, diners and restaurants. I stumbled across Paul Schrader's review of The Wild Bunch while doing research for this. He wrote it in 1969, shortly after the film was released, and it was as he was working as a critic for the Los Angeles Free Press. This was before he'd go on to write films like Taxi Driver and a couple of others for Scorsese. And actually, in light of that, he really focuses on the violence of The Wild Bunch. And reading his review, I saw so much of what's in Casino, even if he didn't have a hand in that film. It's a review that's really well worth seeking out. It's probably in a couple of places online, but there's a Letterboxd account that posts old reviews or comments on films that he posts on Facebooks that has it listed under The Wild Bunch. As I say, well worth a read. But in that review, he wrote, "Great American movies have often flaunted the vulgar exhilaration of killing, and often their vulgarity was what made these films great and American. Hollywood has historically imported European directors to smother the native vulgarity with high drama, sophisticated farce, and drawing room comedy. But the most memorable films continued to spring, often unwanted, indigenously from the violent American spirit." Cinematically, Scorsese kind of grew up in both of these worlds. He'd go to the cinema, develop a love for these sweeping John Ford westerns, while at home, he and his family would gather around the TV and watch these gritty, neo-realist Italian dramas coming out just after the war. And I think he really fuses both of those together in Casino. Schrader would go on to say, "Murder is every dramatist's stock in trade, but American filmmakers have had the unique ability to make the killing seem natural, boyish, and enchanting." Scorsese has this way in pretty much all of his films of shooting everything in this very matter-of-fact style, particularly violence. There's this natural state to it that just comes to the characters. It's a part of their lives, particularly Goodfellas, where it's just business. But while he wanted that in Casino, he wanted the film to feel like the end of Goodfellas. He didn't want that attraction, the coolness that the first two-thirds of it has. He wanted the violence to already be chasing the characters, the doom and fear that catches up with Henry Hill, the helicopters looming over him, but coming from every direction. As Schrader would say, the best American films have had it both ways. They used violence to excite and then applied more violence to comment on that excitement. Putting a stinger in the butterfly, the insouciant, that's a great word, insouciant mayhem, great phrase, became something deeper and more deadly. There's the famous Vice scene in Casino, which was initially just filmed and put in to make everything else in the film seem more mild in the censor's eyes and hopefully steer it away from an NC-17 rating, which is basically a death sentence for American films. It's a bit like a very, very different film. Team America World Police. When Matt Stone and Trey Parker were sending that off to the MPAA, they made that infamous sex scene 3.5 minutes long, much more graphic, so that they wouldn't really pay attention to any of the other possible issues that would crop up. And it worked. In the case of Casino, the MPAA saw the film, and they were generally fine with the Vice scene. They said, for most of the film, cut a few frames here and there, and it's all fine. As so the Vice scene stayed, and Scorsese has said in later years that he thinks that that scene being in there is what cost the film its awards chances, that level of violence and just the violence in the film in general turned a lot of people away. And I think the violence here has the impact that it does because you see the pain that it causes. There's a personal side to it as the film goes on, and it becomes more than just business, as is the case for much of Goodfellas. The gangster similarities of Casino and Goodfellas, I've mentioned the latter a number of times already, they are often pointed out. There's almost a feeling from some people that you have to pick a camp, and I do stand in the Casino camp. I'm in the minority there of preferring it to Goodfellas. But there was clearly something here, particularly in the Las Vegas underworld, that attracted Scorsese. He liked the idea of this whole city, everything playing out in it. He wanted the film to be 3 hours because he felt that a story like this, a story about the city, needed that time, that breadth to play out. And so he said yes to this much more easily than other films that he'd take on where he worried that they were too similar to something that he'd made in the past. In fact, he dropped out of directing Clockers, which Spike Lee eventually went on to make, a brilliant score by Terence Blanchard for that film. He dropped out of making that, and I can see what he might have done with that film, but it's very much a Spike Lee film when you see the final film. But he dropped out of directing that to take on Casino. Back in his Wild Bunch review, Schrader would say the wisdom of the film is the wisdom of experience. It sees that a way of life is dying, but the dying is living on. One of the things that most attracted Scorsese to the film was the idea of how Las Vegas had changed. In the early to mid-90s, he saw that it was becoming the modern go-to gambling destination, gaining this second life, to some extent similar to the new life that his home of New York was forming. On one of the first days of writing the screenplay, start of 1994, he and Pileggi sat down, and he saw this copy of Time magazine, and on the front cover it said, Las Vegas, the all-American city. And he wanted to look at that, what it really meant as the all-American city, what it promised, what it took away, and he kind of wanted to create a bit of a warning while looking at that old world, that former world where these characters were living in the dying breath of the city, this urban western matching what happened when the Wild West had opened up and became impossible to exist anymore. As Schrader put it towards the end of his review, Bonnie and Clyde were heroes who stumbled onto bad times. At another time they might have been quite respectable. The Wild Bunch are killers in search of an environment to justify their depravity. They must create bad times in order to fill a hero's grave. The American mood of violence has changed, and Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch expresses that shift. It is the perversity of a man who loves his country. As Scorsese would say about the film, we're in the outlaw universe, swaggering, lawless, steal and steal more, kill or be killed. The guys in The Wild Bunch have a code of honour. The guys in Casino, in a sense they have their own code of honour and their own system, and it originates far back into the Sicilian past. But unlike the outlaws in Peckinpah's picture, the mob bosses aren't glorified by their sense of honour. It's something that's just between them. The action and dialogue in Casino, they share this idea of playing a game of chance. Everything becomes a gamble, even the consequences. There's a key line asked by one of the mob bosses. Look, why take a chance? And the answer is, because that's the way of life in this desert city, still gambling as it tries to fight its dying breath. And so that's enough waffle from me, or rather reading other people's words. Please, everyone, sit back and enjoy Martin Scorsese's urban western, Casino.